West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. Netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte.
I will say I was gleeful about one thing. You're reporting from inside the courthouse, read like a Grisham novel. You were talking about people sweltering, the courtroom packed. I could also almost see Matthew McConaughey sweating inside. Judge, I got to take a recess. I got to wash all the sweat off my face.
No AC in those courtrooms.
No, yeah.
It was the 90s.
It was the 90s.
That. Anyway.
And did you see Ashley Judge?
Yeah.
I was like, come on, they're going to have to revive her.
I know.
Okay. But Jim, it really was an extraordinary scene inside that courthouse. Take us there and tell us what you know.
Well, first of all, I heard mention of the courthouse steps. That's the cliche, the settlement's courthouse steps. The jury was impaneled. The lawyers are raring to go. As my colleague Jeremy Peters wrote in the paper today, the lapel mics were on. I mean, these lawyers were ready for combat. So when that stops out of the blue and we're sitting there for hours, I mean, the rumors was there bad sushi with the lunch from the jury? So it was just this crazy moment. The other lawyers in the room had not really seen anything like that happen before. So wild moment. And there you have it, settlement, which so many people have predicted all along, but people here on the ground in Delaware, their job was to litigate, and these lawyers were prepped. There were 40 boxes brought into this building. This was going to be a huge trial. So just a crazy moment.
Jim, you've been covering this case for a long time now. Are you surprised at the way that Fox handled or mishandled this, which is to say, all the stuff got out, all the discovery was out there for the world to see, all the texts and the emails, we saw the truth. The whole world saw it, and then they still settled. In hindsight, or have you heard from some people internally at Fox who said, yeah, we should have settled several months ago if that was where this was headed?
Well, there's still a lot more that we want to know about that because of course I'm surprised. I mean, this was an inordinate amount of discovery. Now, I do know that Fox was surprised that this much discovery was allowed to be seen publicly initially. That wasn't a given. The judge allowed some of that to happen. So I think some things were unforeseen by them. Maybe they should have been foreseen. I don't know. But I am really surprised that it got this far before it settled. And by the way, I want to say one thing about this settlement amount. So it's almost $800 million. Their net income in the last fiscal year was $1.2 billion. So this is like a huge amount of annual net income. That's an amazing number.
So, Jim, we heard from the head of Dominion yesterday suggesting that, though we're obviously pleased with this, that there were other people who needed to be held to account, that they sensed that there would be others that they would seek damages from. Who are they?
Well, I think first of all, Dominion has several other cases going. There's Mike Lindell, Newsmax, and then you have separately these Smartmatic suits. I don't see how Newsmax can gut through a case the way that Fox just did. I mean, look at the resources that Rupert Murdoch has. But they're also a smaller company. They don't have the money to settle the way that Rupert Murdoch did. I mean, again, almost $800 million. So there's going to be a lot more coming forward here.
Can I ask about that, though, Jim, really quickly about Newsmax? We had that moment where you had an anchor when Mike Lindell, Mr. Pillow, came on and started lying. The anchor literally got out of his chair and basically, in the words of Eric Cartman, he basically said, "Screw you guys, I'm going home." He got up and walked off the set. Doesn't that show that Newsmax at least tried to move beyond and they made their apologies and tried to mitigate any possible damages?
Well, that was certainly a moment, and but the thing that surprises me, Joe, is that we see those moments, and then I don't know, it never seems to be lasting across this part of the media sphere. So we'll see, right? I mean, Fox News, even during this trial, Tucker Carlson had been airing. He did special reports about January 6th, disputing what happened on January 6th. So, we'll see how much this. Now there's a settlement. People are always seem ready to move on with today's attention spans, to say the least.
So, Jim, we read earlier the statement from Fox News and the slightly ambiguous comment about they accept the court's findings that there may have been some things wrong about what was said about Dominion. Is there anything in this settlement that will impact, in a legal way possibly or any other way, how Fox covers the 2024 election and the outcome of that election?
Again, that remains to be seen. You're seeing a lot of punditry already overnight that this is not going to change anything, that Fox will go forward the way they always go forward, and maybe there's a repeat here. I do want to say there is no planet on which Fox enjoyed this process. There is no way, as Joe pointed out earlier, that this was good for them to have all these internal communications out in the public, and there's no way that Wall Street's going to sit by if there's $800 million settlement after $800 million settlement. So there are various disincentives, but are they trumped by the ratings incentives, the competitive incentives, and what the audience wants, which is kind of the holy grail in the media sphere right now?
So, Jim, let me ask you really quickly on this, just an economics question. Fox News, obviously, I mean, they've been number one since like 1999.
The force.
On and off, but 90% of the time they've been number one. They're a cash cow for Murdoch's empire, a cash cow. But I read something that like $4 billion. They got like $4 billion in cash, right? 800 million's a lot.
They do.
You look at Smartmatic. You got another maybe 800 million. Maybe they don't settle with Smartmatic. Maybe that becomes $1 billion. I mean, suddenly that shakes any organization, any corporation to its core. And the board says, okay, you're going to have to put somebody in charge at Fox News that actually puts up guardrails. Because I know, and Jim, you'll probably agree with me here, no matter what you thought of Roger Ailes, there were guardrails up there. When Glenn Beck went through the guardrails, he fired him. If O'Reilly said something on a night that he had problems with, he called him in. He goes, you went past the line. And again, I know a lot of people hated him, but there were guardrails on, you couldn't accuse American democracy of being rigged. And this has cost them $800 million. Do you think that this impact, the impact of maybe another $800 billion, finally gets them to move and put somebody in charge at Fox News that actually puts guardrails up?
Well, there was talk even before this trial that there was a new kind of added layer of some editorial oversight. Again, you hear that.
You just said this past week Tucker Carlson is lying about January the 6th. While this trial is going on, for the love of God. I mean, is there nobody on the board And again, this is not about politics. This is just about business. Is there nobody on the board that says, maybe we should stop exposing ourselves to billion-dollar lawsuits?
Well, Paul Ryan, in fact, is a member of that board. He had been voicing some of that. And the other thing was...
It's a serious question. It's a serious question. You know what? Not to quote Logan Roy, I love some of these people, but they're not serious people. They're really not. How does any board? I talked to one CEO after another CEO after another CEO that runs big companies. They don't know how this is allowed to happen at a company. An $800 billion exposure. They've got another 800 million, and they've humiliated all of their hosts. They could have protected their hosts from this humiliation, so they've humiliated them. It's the worst of all worlds. They're exposed. And so my point is, they print money. They don't print that much money. At what point is there a reckoning over there? And they put somebody in charge that puts guardrails up editorially.
Well, there's another thing that we haven't mentioned is that there could also be some shareholder lawsuits. Depending on how much of this $800 million is covered, by the way, they have libel insurance. It's always really hard to figure out to find out how much that will cover. But there could be some shareholder lawsuits that would be added pressure on the network.
It is Wednesday, the 19th of April of 2023, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner the English Bulldog is our snoozing sous chef, and our daily special is Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. Will no one rid us of these meddlesome priests? No one. No one will. Boy, the separation of church and state has completely eroded. I wonder who did that. Yes, we wonder. Well, we want to probably give you less of a morning rant because it being the ominous anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, we have a fairly long read today. And rather than abbreviate it too much, we thought we'd, devote a bit more time to that particular article. So why don't we just give you a quick rundown on what we have in store for you here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy as we begin this Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. And yes, at the top, no one in their right mind believes a fine of almost $1 billion will have any effect on Fox's continuous misrepresentations, outright lies, and overt propaganda. No one believes that, though there's some people are trying to make themselves believe it. And I'm looking at you, cable pundits. Yes. Oh, I should warn you. For some reason, my nose is stuffed up this morning. Yes, the pollen has returned, or at least is being registered, because it seemed to have returned a bit earlier before the ticker on the Weather Underground page started registering it. But it is registering now for sure. So on the rest of the menu, the Iowa Senate advanced a bill to loosen child labor laws just in time to defund the schools, too. Concerned with the safety of process servers and his deputies, an Idaho sheriff has declined to serve legal notices on heavily armed Eamon Bundy. And Oklahomans are terrified of right-wing extremists 28 years after Tim McVeigh bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where the European Union is near a deal on a $47 billion law to boost computer chip production. And, as a counterpoint, hunger is soaring and spreading across West Africa. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com. To the right of the page is the chat room link, and the chat room is monitored by the Kelly Lincoln. Thank you, Kelly. Across to the left from that chat room link near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com is the link to our Patreon page. And of course, if you could become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio, it really does help us pay our bills and pay also the accumulated costs that it costs to run this powerhouse of resistance. If you could afford to send us what you might spend on, I don't know, how about an espresso type coffee drink, for instance? Well, if you could send those funds our way once a month, it really does help. So thank you for your generosity, and thank you for considering being so generous in the future. To those of you who have not already been so generous, we thank you all. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, Mastodon, and Spoutable, you could do so at Netroots Radio. The Tom takes care of that. Thank you, Tom. Follow me on Twitter, Mastodon, and Spoutable at Justice Putnam, of course. I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Codes 10 minutes before showtime, and often that doesn't get posted to social media until I get the podcast diary up. But regardless, go to my social media feeds and you'll find links to the list of diaries, and some people call them stories. But nonetheless, that's where the show notes and links can be found. And also, for a little tidbit of information that I barely mentioned, you can find the playlist for the Justice Department Musique Sans Frontières, if you feel so inclined. If you would like to follow the show on Twitter, pardon me, it is the pollen season. If you'd like to follow the show on Twitter, you can do so at Cookbook West and pick up podcasts. Please do. By way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, etc., etc., etc. All right, we better get in on this because I want to get through the Oklahoma City bombing article, which is quite extensive. This first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is by, well, staff at the Associated Press. Lawmakers in Iowa's Senate passed a controversial bill yesterday, Tuesday, that would allow minors to work longer hours and work in currently banned roles like serving alcohol at restaurants. Supporters of the bill, mainly Republicans, said it would give children valuable opportunities to work and get paid, whereas opponents, largely Democrats, said it would harm children. Although 2 Republicans defied their party and voted against the bill with Democrats, the measure still passed 32-17 in the GOP-controlled Senate. The bill requires approval from the Republican-controlled House and from Republican Governor Kim Reynolds to become law. And no one believes there's been an insurgency going on for quite some time. The bill would allow kids under 16 to work up to 6 hours a day. So forget school, which is 2 more hours than currently allowed for that age group. It would also allow 16 and 17-year-olds to serve alcohol at restaurants with written permission from their parents or a guardian. Ultimately, parents and kids will decide if they want to work or not, Reynolds has said favorably about the bill. It teaches the kids a lot. And if they have the time to do it and they want to earn some additional money, I don't think we should discourage that. I had a paper route when I was 12. But it didn't take 6 hours to do. The U.S. Department of Labor's top lawyer, Seema Nanda, disagreed, saying it is irresponsible for states to consider loosening child labor protections. Democrats and labor unions echoed that sentiment, saying the bill would increase the chance of workplace accidents and injuries among youth. The Biden administration this month urged U.S. companies to make sure they are not illegally hiring children to perform dangerous jobs after an investigation found more than 100 kids working overnight and handling hazardous equipment for a company that cleans slaughterhouses across the country. The Labor Department says it has more than 600 child labor investigations underway, and officials are concerned about the exploitation of children, particularly migrants who may not even have a parent in the United States. And do you wonder why they were separated at the border? Do you? Dawson of the Idaho Capital Sun brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. St. Luke's Health System is asking the Idaho Supreme Court to force the Gem County Sheriff to serve legal summonses to anti-government activist Eamon Bundy in its civil lawsuit against him. In a letter written on the 12th of April, Gem County Sheriff Donnie Wunder said Bundy, who lives in Emmett, is, quote, becoming more and more aggressive with his behavior, end quote, when served with these civil notifications. St. Luke's filed a lawsuit against Bundy, his gubernatorial campaign, and other business entities, as well as his associate, Diego Rodriguez, in May. Protests over the hospitalization of Rodriguez's infant grandson last year that resulted in the redirection of emergency services and a lockdown of the downtown Boise campus were simply a grift to enrich themselves and boost their own publicity, the health system said in court documents. Remember, the protest included heavily armed individuals counting, several hundred, who absolutely intimidated and terrorized the downtown area and the hospital in particular because the state was trying to treat their grandson because the kid had been abused physically. Okay. Bundy pleaded guilty to criminal trespassing charges in January, resulting in a suspended jail sentence and 1 year of unsupervised probation, because he has ignored the lawsuit and has not shown up in court. According to St. Luke's, the organization's lawyers said they must use processing companies to serve him with these documents. Bundy, who unsuccessfully ran as an independent governor for governor last year, told Gem County dispatchers he considers processors as trespassers, according to Wunder's letter. The sheriff said Bundy told him during a phone call that he was at his breaking point. Well, that's just too bad. Send in SWAT. My God. By the tone of his voice, I believe he is, Wunder wrote. My concern is with the safety of process servers and my deputies. I don't want to risk harm over a civil issue. Well, the only problem is that state law requires county sheriffs to serve these documents in legal cases. Burris of Raw Story brings us this quite extensive article here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Charlotte Cisneros came of age in Oklahoma City in the wake of the bombing that killed 168 people on April 19, 1995. So when she turned on the new Netflix documentary about Waco last month, it hit her hard. The next day, she watched as the latest school shooting unfolded on her TV screen, this time in Nashville. Among the 6 dead were 3 9-year-olds. Her son is 8. Most of the friends and family I grew up with in Oklahoma didn't feel unsafe, even after the state was a target of the domestic terrorist attack that left over 500 injured. Radical right anti-government views were not the norm in the state, and if they existed, they were discussed in hushed voices and only among racist membership groups most people would not admit to being a part of. This year is the 30th anniversary of Waco, and Oklahoma City's bombing was 28 years ago. The Columbine shooting, which happened on April 20th, was 24 years ago. A generation of Oklahomans who grew up with those major events in their lives are now raising children. Faced with the reality of a new kind of domestic terrorism, it is not about bombs that were built in rental trucks, but legally purchased weapons of war used to mow down children, their teachers or families in mass shootings in schools, while shopping or worshiping at a church or temple. I literally am like, how do I get my son out of the second-floor window in his classroom? Cisneros plotted. He's up the stairs, and I don't know if that's good or bad because it's not as easily accessed, but he cannot easily escape. Then I'm like, oh my God, I'm just thinking too much. Joyce Taylor grew up in Oklahoma, but lived in Washington, D.C. for decades before retiring back to OKC. She was thinking about jetting back to the capital city for a few days next week, but when she saw that the cheapest flights were on Wednesday, April 19th, she decided against it. She explained to Raw Story there's too much associated with that date. Taylor also mentioned that the Boston Marathon bombing was on April 17th and Virginia Tech shooting on April 16th. I watched every minute when they were searching, she said, of the Boston tragedy. So you just pull all of that with some wacko. I've got to avenge this. I've got to avenge that. So that's why, because between April 15th and April 20th, that's when all this stuff has happened. For those that came of age in the aftermath of those massive terrorist attacks on the United States, the current age where the threat of mass shootings has become a part of everyday life is terrifying. It's crazy that even in a small rural school like Lomega with an overall K-12 enrollment of less than 300, you have active shooter drills, Farmer Clay Pope told Raw Story. His 2 youngest children attend classes there. I'm not more scared per se. I'm not scared to go in public. I am scared about the lone killers in schools, but not to the point of panic. It's insane that kids like me see these sorts of drills as normalcy, cut in Pope's 13-year-old daughter, Madeline. I'm a gun owner, Pope said frankly. I grew up around guns. I'm not a huge proponent of gun control. That said, something has to change. What happened in Waco, mixed in with a lot of gun shows, contributed to the radicalization of Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. This incident got the attention of gun rights people, Second Amendment people, what we would now consider militia people, said Dallas Morning News reporter Lee Hancock in the recently released Netflix documentary about Waco. Clad in a red flannel shirt and camouflage cap, McVeigh scratched the right side of his neck while sitting on the hood of a car 2 years before he killed 168 people in a photograph that was on the Netflix special. Just arrived today, he told the news crew. The press was all over the aftermath of Waco and any people protesting the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosive investigation into the Branch Davidians and the subsequent 51-day siege that ended in the deaths of 82 branch members became a story. I guess somebody told me a lot of people are scared to put something on, like this. McVeigh was already upset before Waco, however. His rage had been cooking for a while. Speaking to PBS in 2017, Hancock explained McVeigh came down to Waco and sold bumper stickers with pro-gun, anti-government slogans. He saw the raid as clear evidence of what the government would do to try to confiscate guns and persecute gun owners. You know, like domestic terrorists who want to overthrow the United States of America. There's supposed to be something wrong with that. Confiscating their guns? Well, fear the government that fears your gun, one read. Ban guns, make the streets safe for a government takeover. Another featured a swastika and a hammer and sickle demanding people get control. A man with a gun is a citizen, one sign said. A man without a gun is a subject, they concluded. Less than a year after leaving the military, McVeigh watched the 1992 11-day siege at Ruby Ridge, Idaho. Randy Weaver had come to the attention of authorities while attending meetings at the Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake, Idaho, which emphasized God, guns, and whiteness. The only way to save America was to assert your Christian sovereignty, your white Christian sovereignty, explained writer Leonard Zeskind in the PBS special. There will be a lot of blood running one day, Richard Butler told a group of white supremacists at the compound meeting that was recorded. The U.S. Marshals had turned up at Weaver's ranch with a warrant for his arrest on federal firearms charges. Shots were fired, and Weaver and members of his immediate family refused to surrender. Weaver's wife and 14-year-old son were among those killed during the standoff. Then the Aryan Nations members and their allies had shown up in support of Weaver. Baby killer, one protester shouted. A sign read, Christians against tyranny. A banner read, Whites must arm, while another spread across the street there said, Be white, be Christian, be dead. Watching the ordeal unfold, McVeigh was filled with rage. Growing up being bullied, and now watching what he considered the U.S. Marshals bullying the white supremacists, McVeigh's anger at the U.S. government was growing. In an interview prior to his execution, McVeigh explained, to me it wasn't a start of a war, it was a counterattack. The war had already been started. You think you guys can be ruthless? Let's see how you like it when the fight is brought to you. Reporter Ben Fenwick explained that after leaving the Army and failing to find a job, McVeigh becomes more and more strident. He began paying attention to the really far-off conspiracies like the United Nations was going to take over the United States, and he totally bought into them. At the same time, Fenwick explained that McVeigh began reading the Turner Diaries and attending gun shows. The Turner Diaries is a kind of white supremacist fantasy fiction in which the main character gathers a small group of anti-government fighters to bomb the FBI building in Washington. At that point, the single most important place where the ideas of radical right were spread was at gun shows, said Mark Potok, an internationally renowned expert on the American radical right. McVeigh was engrossing himself in the ideology. Gun shows were sometimes more than just gun shows. The anti-government message, which cloaked itself in the paraphernalia of patriotism, was promoted and peddled at gun shows all over, said writer David Levinas. McVeigh became one of the people selling and trading guns at the gun shows and passing around copies of the Turner Diaries. That's when he began to meet more members of the Aryan Nation and other white supremacy groups. He became embroiled in a larger movement, said Levinas. 6 months after Weaver's standoff, the siege at Waco began. There were 4 federal building targets for McVeigh, but he decided that the best one was Oklahoma City because some of the ATF agents that were involved in Waco had offices based there. He chose April 19th intentionally as a nod to those in Waco who perished in the fire on the last day of the standoff. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building housed the Social Security Administration, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the offices for the Secret Service, the Department of Veterans Affairs Vocation Rehab Counseling Center, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and recurring offices for the U.S. military. There was also the ATF office. Shall we not forget the daycare center on the ground floor? Let's not. Bob Ricks, who worked as the FBI spokesman in Waco, was now the FBI special agent in charge of the Oklahoma City office. Bob, you know what today is? Rick remembers his assistant special agent in charge asking him. At first, I did not know what he was talking about. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Today is April 19th, which is the last day of the standoff at Waco." That immediately set off an antenna that we probably had a reprisal that had taken place as a result of the Waco situation. Herbeck described McVeigh as someone that loved guns and was taught how to shoot and how to respect guns by his grandfather. When he joined the military, McVeigh explained in one of his audio interviews that it was just another way to hone his shooting skills with the government paying for his ammunition. Oh. So in other words, our military has been training terrorists for decades, and they continue to do so. And they also have a right-wing, shall I say, fascist propaganda network on every military base, continuing the brainwashing, the grooming. When will we do something about this? Well, I did not mean to abbreviate the article so much, but you can find it by going to the show notes and links diary on Daily Codes that I have posted. So let us now go to our break, and when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. This week, almost all net. Joining the long list of basketball movies, which date back to the silent film era, is Air, Courting a Legend. Promoted with an expensive Super Bowl ad this year, the sports drama depicts the rise of what's possibly the world's most famous shoe, the Air Jordan, and how the Nike company, which in the mid-1980s was about ready to shutter its basketball division, came to its association with superstar-to-be Michael Jordan. It's not about Jordan himself. The only evidence of him is a tall, young, mostly silent black man included in a few scenes. The characters we do get to know are those of Scout Sonny Vaccaro, Nike chairman Phil Knight, Michael's mother, Dolores, played respectively by Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, who also directs here, and Viola Davis, with strong support from some familiar faces, especially Chris Messina, whose one phone negotiation scene with Sonny is practically worth the price of admission. You'll want to write down some of the insults for the next time you quit a job or have to deal with the ex. They're all working from a sizzling script by Alex Convery, his first, unbelievably. Air was initially conceived as a Prime Video release, with the thinking that it didn't have marketability past dedicated roundball fans, but audience testing soon told the studio otherwise. Some shade has come the film's way, however, due primarily to it having the appearance of a 2-hour promotion for Nike, which it kind of is, and more generally for its approving depiction of capitalism and the uber-rich. But hey, leftist econ professors watch the Super Bowl, so you can enjoy Air guilt-free. This has been Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. Catch up with us at TakeTwoMovieReview.com and feed us back on our channel on YouTube.
How many books would you say you have?
Oh, I don't know.
Sylvia Federici's home is full of books. They're stuffed into cupboards, under beds, jammed in kitchen cabinets. Two other editors from Scientific American and I are trying to find this famous Italian scholar some olive oil, but we can't find any. Only more books, which Sylvia keeps excitedly pointing out.
And that booklet was very important for me because it spoke about the witch hunt.
We're at a dinner that we've dubbed the Witch Frittata Party.
Oh, and I brought red wine. You have to. Oh, yeah, very, very perfect.
To clarify, yes, we are a group of women, and Sylvia's philosopher husband George, sitting in a circle. We are, in fact, eating a frittata. But we are not, at least by any of our admission, witches. But in 16th century Italy, as women assembling and talking about reproductive labor and justice, we could most certainly have been tried. Today, we'll talk to two witch-hunting scholars and take you on a journey from the Middle Ages in Italy to Salem, Massachusetts to the present day to look at some surprising links between reproductive health, labor, and witch hunts. For Scientific American Science Quickly, I'm Talika Bose.
So they arrest the woman and then they torture her to death until she has revealed all the names of the other.
Sylvia's actually telling me about the horrifying history of the change in meaning of the word gossip.
For the first century and a half, witchcraft is always seen as a collective crime. Right? This idea that when women come together, they do something that is no good.
Silvia Federici is one of history's most famous feminist scholars. And for one night, I got to pick her brain about witch hunts. But there's something else I want to know. As a scholar of domestic labor, how does that tie into witch hunts?
I wanted to understand what had been the path from the pre-capitalist Europe to capitalist Europe.
It all goes back to the Black Death in Europe. Around this time, the mid-1300s.
And there was a hunger for labor because many had died. It creates a whole new concern, about marriage, about reproduction, children.
This coincides with the rise of certain heretic movements, like the Cathars, who contradicted the edicts of the established church. Now, let's fast forward to the 1400s.
Witchcraft appears at first as a form of heresy.
But there's more than meets the eye in this story. While the story is about witch hunts, it's also about controlling women's bodies for the creation of a labor market and the creation of a peasant class in post-feudal Europe.
By the 1500s, you have colonization, and this begins to bring silver into Europe. And the more silver comes, the more enclosures, the more people are kicked off the land, and the land is turned to commercial use.
Sylvia actually argues that the creation of capitalism in Europe was a motivating factor in the rise of witch hunts. As she and other scholars have argued, expansions of capitalism also caused women to lose their social standing and their land. Particularly vulnerable were older women. By the 1600s, an edict is issued. It has to do with witches and their apparent ability to stop reproduction.
There's a pope that accuses witches basically of abortion and contraception.
And it's often women who were knowledgeable about reproductive health care who were targeted for witchcraft.
Women were the ones who cured. They were the ones who, in addition to farming, had the herbal garden. Because of the children, because of the reproduction, they were the ones who knew about the herbs. And so they are immediately suspected.
According to Sylvia, the accusation of witchcraft relied on targeting people who allegedly interfered with procreation, including abortion, because poor workers were a valuable form of capital.
Many, many times when they burnt women, they also burned gay people.
That, by the way, was for the crime of not procreating. This theme around women's roles in domestic labor also shows up in the Salem witch trials. I spoke to Alice Cantor, a writer who happens to be a descendant of a woman tried for witchcraft.
Her name was Martha Carrier. She was 7 months pregnant when she got married, so that's sort of a big Puritan, don't do that. She was known for being sort of this outspoken, very had a habit of yelling at her neighbors kind of lady.
Side note, this is around the time I found out about a medieval torture device called a scold bridle, once placed over women's heads to keep them from talking, but that's another story. Now, while Salem didn't have the same obsession with killing people for the crime of preventing procreation, if you were tried for witchcraft, Alice said it was still related in some way to reproductive labor.
If we zoom out and we think from a sort of broader perspective about what reproduction is, not just pregnancy and giving birth, but all of the work that it takes to keep someone alive and the care work that is part of reproductive labor, that aspect does appear in Salem. Because this care work was extremely gendered, it was women's work.
Not only that, but there were still incidents of women being tried for aiding in abortion.
Some of them were killed, were midwives who provided abortions or contraceptives.
Alice had something to say about witch hunts in the present day, too.
Witch hunts are not over. At least 1,000, probably in the low thousands, if people are accused of witchcraft and suffer violence as a result, whether they're killed, tortured, expelled from their homes, or ostracized in the present.
You can read more about modern witch hunts in a new Scientific American article by Alice Cantor and Silvia Federici. There's a lot we can take away from a historical study of witch hunts, especially in our current climate, but I'll leave you with something that Alice said.
The witch hunts of the past are echoing in the present.
Thanks for listening. For Scientific American Science Quickly, I'm Talika Bose.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, and since you're listening to netrootsradio.com, show your progressive side and go to the donate button on the bottom of the homepage. It's progressives like you who power Netroots Radio and keep the progressive message beaming everywhere 24 hours a day. Just go to our donate button at the bottom of netrootsradio.com. Thank you for keeping progressive radio at full power.
Two young black men being expelled from the Tennessee House of Representatives has raised the question, for legislators, how free is their free speech? I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. In April, the Tennessee House of Representatives expelled Justin Pearson and Justin Jones, two young black representatives, from their elected positions because they engaged in a loud but peaceful, nonviolent, words-only protest on the floor of the State House of Representatives. The reason for their protest? 6 people, including 3 9-year-old children, had just been slaughtered in another mass shooting, this time at a private Christian school in Nashville, and the representatives at the podium protested their deaths and the lack of legislative action. In response, the overwhelmingly white legislature threw them out of the House. But the electoral process quickly returned them to their positions, and they can't be thrown out again for the same reason. Only twice before since the Civil War has the Tennessee House expelled a member, once for bribery and once for sexual misconduct. How is a protest remotely as serious as that? It's not. But legislatures are the judge and jury of the qualifications of their members to hold office. They have the power, especially when one party has a supermajority, as in Tennessee, when there is an alleged breach of the rules, to decide what to do. Which brings us to Lord Acton's famous quote, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU because freedom can't protect itself.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1995. This marks the day one of the most horrendous acts of domestic terrorism in U.S. history occurred in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. A truck bomb exploded at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people. 99 of those killed worked for the federal government. 8 were federal law enforcement agents. Those who lost their lives worked for governmental agencies including the Secret Service, U.S. Customs, the Department of Agriculture, Drug Enforcement Administration, Department of Transportation, Army and Marine Corps Recruiting, U.S. Customs, the Social Security Administration, Housing and Urban Development, and the Federal Employee Credit Union. On that horrific day, 19 children were killed, including 15 who were at a daycare center in the building. The blast left 680 people people injured and maimed. More than 300 neighboring buildings were damaged or destroyed, totaling more than $600 million in damages. In the rescue effort, more than 12,000 people participated to aid those injured in the blast and to help recover those who had died. One of the men responsible for the bombing was executed for his crime. The other received a life sentence in prison. Today, a national monument and museum honors those who died. More than 4.4 million visitors have paid their respects at the memorial. One of the prominent features of the memorial is the survivor tree. A more than 100-year-old American elm stood in the parking lot across from the building. It survived the blast, and although it lost most of its branches, the tree thrives to this day. An inscription on a wall around the tree reads, "The spirit of this city and this nation will not be defeated. Our deeply rooted faith sustains us." Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com. Like us on Facebook and follow us on the Twitters at Labor History in 2. Thank you for accompanying us here to the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. We always begin, whether from around the world, along the banks of the Rogue River and the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon, on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 38 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting a high of around 52 or so, a bit cooler than what we had yesterday. Rain showers early, which we had overnight, by the way, becoming more intermittent for the afternoon. Winds out of the west at 5 to 10 miles per hour. And then a very small chance of rain overnight with cloudy conditions, lows in the mid-30s, winds out of the north-northeast at 5 to 10 miles per hour. And then cloudy tomorrow with highs in the mid to upper 50s, winds light and variable. And then it looks like we might have a warming trend bumping into the 70s beginning in just a couple of days. So we'll see how that portends. Well, I mentioned pollen out there is finally being registered, and it looks like grass pollen is in the moderate range, and that might be what's causing my stuffed nose, maybe. The air quality index for our little town of Rogue River is in the good range at 31 parts per million, though that daytime UV index is high at level 7, so take care. Barometric pressure is rising rapidly, by the way, at 30.21 inches. Visibility is at 8 miles, and relative humidity is at 90%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. London is 59 degrees and fair. Paris is 65 and partly cloudy. Rome is 66 and fair, though they do have an advisory for a possible disruption due to thunderstorms. Kyiv is 57 degrees and cloudy. Kabul is 50 and clear. Hong Kong is 76 degrees with heavy thunderstorms. Tokyo is 62 and mostly cloudy. Sydney, Australia is 65 and mostly cloudy. San Francisco, California is 50 degrees and sunny. And New York is 51 degrees Fahrenheit, cloudy, with a small craft advisory, of course, due to wind. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world.
Associated Press brings us this first amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. Will no one rid us of these meddlesome priests? No one. The European Union was closing in on Tuesday yesterday on approval for a plan to ramp up semiconductor production as it seeks to wean itself off reliance on Asia for the tiny computer chips that control everything from cars to washing machines. The European Parliament and the bloc's 27 member states struck an informal agreement for the 43 billion euro, which is equivalent to 47 billion US, CHIPS Act, which pools public and private funds and allows for state aid to kickstart massive investments for chip-making facilities. The CHIPS Act puts Europe in the first line of cutting-edge technologies, which are essential for our green and digital transitions. Ebba Busch, Industry Minister for Sweden, which holds the rotating EU presidency, said in a statement, the EU is scrambling to keep up with the U.S., which launched its own $52 billion CHIPS Act to boost the American semiconductor industry. The EU CHIPS Act will link research, design, and testing, as well as coordinate EU and national investment. It aims to help the semiconductor industry develop so that the bloc's global market share of chip production can double to 20% by 2030. Both the U.S. and the EU want to reduce their dependence on Asia, which accounts for the bulk of global semiconductor production, a vulnerability that was exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, when supply chain disruptions led to extended shortages of autos, smartphones, and medical devices. How about toilet paper? Smart toilet paper! Chips are integrated circuits that are embedded in a semiconductor, a material, notably silicon, that can manage the flow of electric current. The terms chip and semiconductor are often used interchangeably. That last information obviously must be for people a lot older than us who have absolutely no idea what we're talking about.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière. La promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle. C'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer. Mais automne, quand les feuilles tombent partout, si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Sam Mednick of the Associated Press brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Hunger is soaring and spreading across West Africa, with some 48 million people, a 10-year high, facing food insecurity in the conflict-riddled region, the UN warned, driven primarily by violence as well as economic fallout from COVID-19 and inflation. Food insecurity has heavily impacted Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, northern Nigeria, and Mauritania, UN officials said at a press conference in Senegal's capital, Dakar, yesterday, Tuesday. UN officials said that for the first time, some 45,000 people in the Sahel region, the arid expanse below the Sahara Desert, are on the brink of starvation, one step away from famine. The vast majority facing catastrophic levels of hunger, 42,000, are in Burkina Faso. the officials said. Violence linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group has ravaged both Burkina Faso and Mali for years. Jihadis have blockaded dozens of villages in the region, cut off access to farms, and lined the roads with explosives, making it hard for residents to move freely and forcing aid agencies to fly in food assistance, which is costly. People living in besieged towns in Burkina Faso say they are struggling to survive. A few aid groups have managed to provide rice, oil, and beans, but women cannot grind millet because there's no gas, and people cannot leave the town because it's surrounded by jihadis, a resident said. As civilians flee attacks and militants expand their reach in Burkina Faso, hunger also is spreading across the border to neighboring Togo and Benin. Nearly 1 million people are expected to be food insecure in Benin and Togo, almost double the number from 2 years earlier. For the first time, both countries asked aid groups for assistance in dealing with the influx of displaced people and refugees. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on, and we will meet up here tomorrow for Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks, and boy is it breaking. And we will meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. À fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goer. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair, t'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.